In July 1928, a band of Roger soldiers, military looters in all but name, broke into Yuling, the mausoleum of Emperor Qianlong, and entered his underground palace. After hours of effort, they finally forced open the last stone gate of the burial chamber. But what they found inside shocked them. Qianlong's coffin had somehow moved behind the gate, pressing against it from within, almost as if the dead emperor himself were trying to block the entrance and protect the women buried behind him. This was not just a robbery, it was the beginning of one of the most disturbing episodes in the history of China's imperial tombs. In the previous episode, we explored the altered approach to Emperor Qianlong's Yuling. To understand why later generations believed Qianlong might still be defending his tomb after death, we must first pass through the ritual house above ground and then descend into the underground palace where the legend truly begins. Yuling was not only a burial site, it was a palace for the dead. The divine kitchen and the storehouse prepared traditional Chinese ritual meals for the deceased emperor, empresses, and imperial consorts. Unlike most imperial buildings, the divine kitchen and the storehouse makes unusually heavy use of red on its timber framework. Since this was the place of ritual cooking and fire, the color itself matched the building's function. At the center of this stretch of the Spirit Way stands the Stele Pavilion of the Spirit Way, a feature found in most Ming and Qing imperial tombs. The stele inside records Qianlong's temple name and posthumous title. It was inscribed under his successor, the Jiaqing Emperor, and sealed with Jiaqing's imperial mark. Qianlong's abbreviated posthumous title was Emperor Chun. In Chinese, the character Chun suggests constancy, firmness, and staying true to one's cause. For Qianlong, this title was remarkably fitting. Over 60 years on the throne and 3 more years ruling in practice as retired emperor, he repeatedly pushed his own decisions through with extraordinary force of will, whether in war, politics, cultural ritual, or the design of his own mausoleum. Once Qianlong made up his mind, he carried it through to the end. Behind the Stele Pavilion of the Spirit Way stands a group of ritual kitchen buildings that still preserve a distinctly Manchu way of life. The eastern side room, also known as the tea and meal room, was used to prepare milk tea and fresh fruit for the deceased imperial family. Across from it stood the western side room, or the Bobo room, where flour-based pastries were made, the traditional Manchu foods known as bobo. Even in death, Qing emperors continued to be served according to Manchu dietary customs. During the Qing Dynasty, the Han Chinese population far outnumbered the Manchus. For Qianlong, preserving Manchu language, writing, archery, and traditional customs was not nostalgia. It was a matter of dynastic survival. He wanted the Qing to stand as the supreme continuation of the Chinese Empire, while still preserving the Manchu roots that had created it. After the east and west side rooms, we reached the Jade Belt River, a waterway symbolizing the flow of wealth and prosperity, crossed by a 3-root 3-arc stone bridge. It is clear that Yuling was built in a landscape exceptionally rich in water sources. The same water that made Yuling auspicious also created one of its earliest technical problems. precisely because Yuling was built in such a water-rich landscape. When the project was nearly completed in 1752, the 17th year of Qianlong's reign, officials discovered the science of water seepage inside the underground palace. But as an emperor with absolute authority, Qianlong did not choose to rebuild the underground palace from scratch. Instead, he ordered repairs, drainage, and technical corrections. So, why did he make that decision? This story begins with Qianlong's first official empress, Empress Xiaoxian. Born in 1712, she married the future Qianlong Emperor in 1727, when he was still an imperial prince. The two shared a deep and intimate bond. She gave birth to Qianlong's second son, Yonglian, and his seventh son, Yongchong, but tragically, both boys died young. In 1748, Empress Xiaoxian fell ill and passed away. For Qianlong, her death was not only a personal tragedy, it also created an urgent ritual problem. His beloved first empress still had to be formally laid to rest in the mausoleum he had chosen. By 1752, Qianlong was determined to have her coffin formally installed in Yuling as soon as possible. That is why, when water seepage was discovered inside the underground palace, he chose to repair it through technical means rather than rebuild it somewhere else. The decorations on the bridge's pillar tops are one of the most exceptional details in Yuling. Here, the pillar tops are carved with phoenix motifs, symbols traditionally associated with the empress. Nothing like this had appeared in any earlier mausoleum of a Chinese emperor. For Qianlong, the phoenix pattern here was a quiet but powerful way of honoring and remembering Empress Xiaoxian. After crossing the stone arch bridge, we find a great tiled guardhouse on each side. These buildings were originally used by 8 banner soldiers assigned to guard the mausoleum. Today, they are still used by modern side guards. This system of separate guardhouses became one of the distinctive features of Qing Imperial mausoleums. Ahead of us is the Longen Gate. The name Longen means enduring and magnificent imperial grace. Passing through the gate, Yuling becomes less a road of imperial display and more a closed world of ritual memory. The first structures we encounter upon entering the ritual zone are a pile of silk burning furnaces, places where written prayers, silk offerings, and other ritual goods were burned during ceremonies. Covered entirely with yellow glazed tiles, these furnaces looked like miniature sacred buildings. Inside the furnace chambers were lined with iron, allowing them to withstand the intense heat of ritual burning. But compared with the silk burning furnaces at Shouhuanghao, another imperial complex in Beijing expanded during the Qianlong era. The furnaces there are clearly taller, larger, and more monumental. Located north of the Forbidden City, Shouhuanghao hosted and honored the imperial portraits of Qing emperors and empresses. This contrast shows that Qianlong still followed the traditional Chinese principle of filial piety. Before the spirits of his ancestors, even he remained a dissident, a filial son within the hierarchy of ancestral ritual. At the center of the ritual zone stands Longen Hall, the main hall where sacrifices were offered to the deceased emperor, empresses, and imperial consorts. The eastern side hall, standing to its east, served as a supporting ritual space. While Longen Hao was under repair, the Imperial Spirit Tablets could be temporarily enshrined here. It also functioned as a storage space for ritual offerings before they were formally presented or burned. The western side hall served a very different purpose. This was where lamas recited Buddhist scriptures to pray for the salvation of the deceased members of the imperial family. Among all Qing rulers, the Qianlong Emperor had the deepest connection with Tibetan Buddhism. He envisioned himself as a Chakravartin, a sacred Buddhist ruler and protector of the Dharma, and promoted the image of himself as an incarnation of Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. Through this religious identity, Qianlong built political and cultural prestige among Tibetan nobles and ordinary believers. At the foot of Longen Hao lies a massive Danbi stone, carved with a dragon and phoenix motif. In Chinese symbolism, the dragon represents the emperor, while the phoenix represents the empress. Together, they suggest that even in the world after death, the imperial couple would remain united in harmony. Inside the Longen Hao, 3 imperial thrones are displayed. The throne in the center belonged to the Qianlong Emperor himself. The throne on the east side belonged to his first official wife and Empress Xiaoxian. The throne on the west side belonged to Empress Xiaoyi of the Weijia clan. She was Qianlong's consort during her lifetime, but was posthumously honored as empress because she was the biological mother of the Qing Emperor. To the west of the 3 imperial thrones is the West Warm Chamber. Here were enshrined the spirit tablets of the other 3 occupants of Yuling's underground palace: Imperial Noble Consort Huixian, Imperial Noble Consort Zhemin, and Imperial Noble Consort Shujia. In this way, all 6 occupants of Yuling's underground palace were represented within the ritual space. But one woman was missing: Qianlong's second official empress, Lady Nara. She was neither buried inside Qianlong's underground palace, nor represented here in Longen Hao. Instead, she was placed in the nearby Yuling concubines cemetery. Why was an official empress excluded from Qianlong's own afterlife world? To the east of the 3 imperial thrones is the East Warm Chamber, which is currently not open to visitors. Inside this chamber is a statue of释迦牟尼Buddha. This made Yuling the first mausoleum of a Qing emperor to contain a Buddhist hall within its main ritual building. But the precedent actually came from the Taidongling Mausoleum, the tomb of Qianlong's mother, Empress Dowager Xiaoxian. She was a devoted believer in Tibetan Buddhism, and to honor her faith, Qianlong built a Buddhist hall inside the Longen Hao of her mausoleum. Later, he repeated this design in his own Yuling Mausoleum. In this way, Buddhist devotion, filial piety, and imperial afterlife architecture were brought together in one ritual space. But even this sacred Buddhist space could not protect Yuling from the violence of the modern age. Qianlong could design eternity, but he could not control history. Today, on the terrace in front of Longen Hao, only a single bronze deer still stands alone. Originally, this platform should have been furnished with a complete set of ritual bronze objects: a pile of bronze incense burners, a pile of bronze crayons, and a pile of bronze deer. Together, they symbolized auspiciousness, longevity, and the emperor's journey into an immortal realm after death. But now, 5 of them are gone. All that remains are their empty stone pedestals. The reason lies in the violence of 1928. That year, the Nanjing nationalist government completed the Northern expedition and defeated the Beiyang warlord regime, a military political order that had grown out of the armed forces of the late Qing Dynasty. As the Beiyang system collapsed, the old network that had helped protect the imperial tombs also fell apart. The guards who had remained loyal to the former royal house lost their backing, and the eastern Qing tombs were left almost completely undefended. In July, a large military force nominally under the Nanjing nationalist government entered the eastern Qing tombs under the pretext of conducting military exercises. They sealed off the mausoleum area and brutally looted two of its most important tombs: Yuling, the mausoleum of Emperor Qianlong, and Dingdongling, the mausoleum of Empress Xiaoxian. What remains today is a visible wound left by the violence of 1928. At the threshold between the ritual area and the burial area, Qianlong looked not to his father's Tailing or his grandfather's Jingling, but further back to his great-grandfather Shun Zhici Xiaoling. In front of the three glazed gates, he placed another Jade built river, using flowing water once again to symbolize will's auspicious energy and life-giving force. The stone bridges over the Jade-built river feature some of the most elaborate carvings in Qing Imperial Mausoleum architecture. At the ends of the bridge railings are torching Kaoshan dragons, guardian-like dragon figures carved in stone. They seem to brace the bridge, guard the passage, and mark the sacred threshold between the ritual courtyard and the burial world. Chinese emperors often described themselves as the true dragon son of heaven. Even the flag of the late Qing Empire used the dragon as its central image. Here, the dragon was not merely decorative. It was a symbol of heaven-sanctioned imperial authority. Emperor Qianlong's distinctive aesthetic vision and his uncompromising personal will can also be seen in the structure before us. This building is called the Two-Pillar Gate. It is made up of two stone pillars, with a wooden structure placed between them. But this was not a passageway for the coffins of the emperor, empresses, and the imperial noble consorts. Instead, it worked more like a visual frame. By narrowing and focusing the viewer's line of sight, it directed the eyes of worshippers toward the Royal City and the Soul Tower behind it. In the previous episode, we introduced Qianlong's innovative new form of the dragon and the phoenix gate. In fact, the Qianlong era dragon and the phoenix gate was created by combining 5 two-pillar gates of different sizes. These were all part of Qianlong's personal architectural innovations, and he applied them directly to his own mausoleum. Behind the two-pillar gate stands the 5 stone offerings, a standard feature in Ming and Qing imperial mausoleums. This arrangement also reflects the influence of Buddhist ritual culture. At the center is a stone incense burner. On either side stand 2 stone flower vases, and further out are 2 stone candlesticks. They symbolize internal incense, internal fragrance, and internal light. But the 5 stone offerings here are carved with extraordinary intricacy and elegance. Their style is clearly different from the more restrained examples found in earlier Chinese imperial tombs. Once again, they reveal the height of imperial wills in the Qianlong era, and a broader taste for luxury, refinement, and visual splendor that shaped both the emperor and the elite culture of 18th century China. The sloping path before us is known in Chinese architecture as Jiangcha, a rigid stone ramp rather than a conventional staircase. Instead of climbing step by step, worshippers had to move slowly upward along this inclined surface. The very act of ascending forced the body into a slightly bowed posture, creating a physical sense of humility and reverence before reaching the monumental square city. The architecture did not merely guide the eyes, it disciplined the body. This ramp was designed to make worshippers bow, but in July 1928, it was climbed by men who had come not to worship but to loot. They were rogue soldiers nominally under the Nanjing nationalist government. Long before they arrived, these rogue soldiers had heard the legends. Beneath Yuling lay Qianlong's underground Buddhist realm, filled with treasures beyond imagination. They came prepared, carrying large quantities of military explosives. They broke through the brick-filled tomb passage and eventually reached the underground palace. On the outside of the first stone door, we can see two supporting stone pillars. These two particular pillars were not added after the destruction caused by the rogue soldiers in 1928. They are believed to date back to 1799, when Emperor Qianlong was formally entombed in Yuling. During this process, cracks had already been found in the stone structure above the first door. With the imperial approval of the Qing Emperor, these two supporting pillars were likely added before the tomb passage was finally sealed. In order to reinforce the first stone door, it is important to note that not all the supporting pillars inside the underground palace date from this period. The other pillars were added much later during modern conservation work. In other words, even at the moment when Qianlong's underground palace was being closed for eternity, it was already showing signs of structural stress. Everywhere inside this underground palace, one can sense the presence of Buddhism. Sanskrit inscriptions are carved on both sides of the gates, while the stone doors themselves are adorned with images of Bodhisattvas. Each door was not only a barrier, but also a sacred Buddhist threshold. Together, they turned the tomb into something almost like an underground Buddhist realm. Even the vaulted ceiling of the front chamber is carved with carvings of Bodhisattvas and Buddhist ritual offerings. On the walls of the middle chamber of the underground palace are exquisite Buddhist carvings known as the 5 sensory offerings. From front to back, they show silk, fruit, an incense burner, a pipa, and a mirror. These objects symbolize the 5 senses: touch, taste, smell, sound, and such. In this Buddhist underground palace, the desires of the human world are transformed into sacred offerings, accompanying Emperor Qianlong, his empresses, and his Imperial Noble Consorts on their journey toward an internal Buddhist realm. The rogue soldiers forced their way inside and opened the first 3 stone doors, but when they reached the 4th door, they were stopped. No matter how hard they pushed, the final stone door would not move. In the end, the soldiers resorted to explosives and blasted it open. But when the shattered door finally gave away, they were stunned by what they saw. Emperor Qianlong's coffin had somehow moved away from its stone bed and was pressed tightly against the 4th stone door. It was as if the dead emperor himself was making one final stand, defending his afterlife realm. After blasting open the 4th stone door by force, The rogue soldiers broke into the deepest part of Yuling's underground palace, the Golden Chamber, the final burial chamber. There, they carried out brutal looting of the burial treasures. Originally, 6 people were buried inside Yuling's underground palace: Emperor Qianlong, Empress Xiaoxian, Empress Xiaoyi, and 3 Imperial Noble Consorts Huixian, Zhemin, Shujia. After the looting, their coffins and remains were severely damaged and disturbed. Apart from one relatively well-preserved female body later identified by former Qing imperial clansmen as Empress Xiaoyi, the remains of the other 5 had become mixed together. After the Eastern Qing tomb's robbery shocked the entire country, representatives sent by Pu Yi, the abdicated emperor, entered Yuling to carry out a reburial. In the end, the remains of Emperor Qianlong, Empress Xiaoxian, and 3 Imperial Noble Consorts were gathered together and placed inside Qianlong's inner coffin. The relatively well-preserved body of Empress Xiaoyi was reburied separately. So, the coffins we see today inside Yuling's underground palace no longer represent the original one-person, one-coffin order. In 1975, history seemed to repeat itself when Chinese cultural heritage workers tried to reopen Yuling's underground palace. The strange phenomenon happened again. The 4th stone door had already been blasted down during the looting of 1928. As a result, the 3rd stone door had effectively become the last functioning barrier of the underground palace. Yet this door would not open. The workers had to use jacks to force it open little by little, and what they saw behind it was astonishing. Qianlong's inner coffin had once again appeared behind the stone door, as if the emperor were blocking outsiders once again. The fact that Qianlong's coffin left its coffin bed twice and tried to block the stone doors happened under relatively dry conditions, without water providing buoyancy. So, was this truly Emperor Qianlong displaying his spiritual power in this way? Perhaps the answer will only be revealed in the future, when human technology has advanced enough to invent a machine or some form of communication that can cross the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Today, Yuling remains one of the most important sites open to visitors in the Eastern Qing tombs. At the time of my filming, restoration work could still be seen. Emperor Qianlong, his empresses, and his Imperial Noble Consorts continue to rest quietly inside the underground palace, silently witnessing the changes of history. But there was one person who never entered this underground palace. She was Qianlong's 2nd official empress, Lady Nara. This woman, once an empress of the Great Qing Empire, was eventually placed in the nearby Yuling concubines cemetery and even buried together with Imperial Noble Consort Chunhui. So why was she excluded from Qianlong's own underground palace? And what kind of dramatic palace storm lay behind this decision? We will reveal the story in the next episode.